Hello, my friends. My name is Cole. Welcome back to Boas and Buffoonery. Today, I want to break down 5 reptile myths that just won't die. I have been educating people about reptiles for about 4 years now, but all throughout my childhood and my teenage years, I was pretty much doing the same thing, just not getting paid for it. I love talking to people about reptiles, but that means I also end up talking to a lot of people who don't really know a whole lot about reptiles. Except they think they do. They have all these different myths and beliefs that have built up over time that lead them to think some pretty whack things about these animals that I am deeply, deeply passionate about. So today, I want to break down some of these myths, explain why people might think that, tell you why they don't make any sense, and what the truth behind the lies actually is. So let's get into it. The first reptile myth, and maybe the most commonly believed reptile myth globally, is that reptiles are cold-blooded. In reality, reptiles are ectothermic. What does this truly mean? Because a reptile's blood is not actually cold unless the room that they are in or the space that they are in is also cold. Ectothermic simply means that reptiles do not produce their own body heat. They do not regulate their body temperature internally. Instead, they rely on their environment to regulate their body temperature. Unlike things like mammals, which are endothermic, meaning we produce and regulate our own body temperature. We increase our body temperature by burning food in the form of calories, which heats up our body. But we also can cool our bodies off by sweating. Reptiles don't do that. If a reptile needs to cool down, they need to go to a cooler place. Some reptiles will bury themselves to cool themselves down. Some reptiles, like our northern water snakes, our Neuroidea here in Ontario, will go swimming to cool themselves off instead, which is quite cool. But this is also why you see reptiles basking. They are out on like a warm rock on a sunny day, soaking up that heat because that is how they warm their bodies up. Now, most people who use the word cold-blooded know this already. So why am I being a pedantic jerk about saying we need to stop using the term cold-blooded and instead just use the term ectothermic? The reason why I think this verbiage is actually important is because people have just a pop culture association with the words cold-blooded. You usually hear the words cold-blooded followed by like cold-blooded killer, cold-blooded monster. If someone cheats in a game or a sport, they're cold-blooded. If someone lies to you, they could be cold-blooded. And that's really why I want to distance like reptiles from the word cold-blooded, because reptiles have enough kind of social problems already. They have enough of a PR nightmare already. We don't need to go adding to those problems using language that people already associate negatively. And that sort of brings me to my second myth that I wanted to break down today. An overarching theme of these myths about reptiles is that they portray reptiles as cold, uncaring, unthinking monsters. And that sort of leads me to my second myth, and that is that reptiles do not care for their young. There is this perception that reptiles don't really care or feel towards anything, and there is a perception that animals that care for their young well are better, are more like morally good, which is why I wanted to provide some examples of reptiles that do actually care for their young. The reality is, in the wild, most animals are pretty lousy parents, and this includes many mammal species. For example, if a panda has multiple cubs, they will almost always abandon one of them. There is a species of seal called the hooded seal, and don't get me wrong, I love seals, but they will nurse their young for about 4 days and then they'll abandon them forever. Sometimes even going so far as to attack their babies after they've stopped nursing them. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but they do that. And most reptiles kind of fall closer to this category. Most reptiles do sort of abandon their young after they hatch, but not all of them. I think a great example is crocodilians, who will not only guard the nest of their babies while they are still in the egg, but once they hatch, they will often carry them to the water because most of the predators of baby crocodilians exist on land and are not nearly as bold when approaching them in the water, especially water that is already full of adult crocodilians. So this is just one way that they help ensure the survival of their young. Another really cool example of reptiles sort of helping out their babies in the early stages of development is in pythons. And I think this is one most people definitely don't expect, is that pythons will actually sort of warm up the eggs of their babies by shivering. Many species of pythons can, to some extent, actually increase their body temperature by shivering, which is a pretty unique thing across squamata in particular. But these particular squamates will wrap themselves around their nest of eggs and shiver their body to help keep those eggs at an optimal temperature. It's this really cool mix of a couple of different reptile myths being debunked all in one. One is reptiles actually being sort of pseudo endothermic for a little bit, but two, doing so in order to preserve their children. And many reptiles don't lay eggs at all. There are plenty of reptiles, like our garter snakes, that will give birth to live young. Boas do this as well. And a really cool example is actually blue-tongued skinks. I feel like I've been talking about blue-tongued skinks lately. I really like them a lot. But not only do blue tongues give birth to live young, but they will also, to some extent, protect their babies. They will sort of guard their babies for a short period of time, which is quite cool and something you definitely wouldn't expect from this little derpy lizard from Australia. And like, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to convince you that reptiles make some of the best parents in the animal kingdom, because the reality is most of them don't. I'm also not using the example of birds in this video, even though birds are reptiles, because they live so much differently. They are behaviorally so distinct from the rest of the reptiles that I don't feel it actually like helps the point I'm trying to make, because we kind of know that birds are pretty half decent parents, so I just didn't think it was necessary to bring up. Continuing on with the theme of debunking the image of reptiles as cold, unthinking, uncaring monsters, there's this perception that reptiles are stupid, that reptiles are dumb. And I actually think that those of us within the reptile community don't do a very good job dispelling this myth very often, because I love to joke about how dumb my pet snakes are, and they behave in a way that is silly and goofy and seems dumb. But that doesn't mean that they're not thinking. It doesn't mean that reptiles don't process information at all. They do it in a way that is very different than mammals, and they do it in a way that is very different from other reptiles, including the birds, which are some of the smartest animals in the entire world. Like, crows are actively using tools, but again, that's why I didn't want to bring up birds too much in this video, so I'll stop talking about them. But there are some consistent examples of reptiles showing intelligence in a way that even humans can understand it. For example, monitor lizards, I think it's particularly Asian water monitors, have been seen counting up to 6, which is quite cool. Redfoot tortoises, when challenged with a maze, have been able to memorize specific locations that they have been fed at throughout the maze and can make their way back to that location for food. There are also reptiles that use sort of ambush hunting strategies that implement tools. My favorite example of this is actually the American alligator, which during birds' nesting season will stack twigs and sticks sort of on their snout and hold them out of the water, so that while birds are flying around looking to build their nest, they will trap them. They will wait for a bird to approach them looking to pick up one of these twigs, and that's when they will catch their meal. It's a really cool hunting strategy that, like, objectively involves forethought, which is the main thing that seems to be removed from reptiles in the public perception. And to share a personal example, I have worked with reptiles for a long time, and one of the things that I love teaching my reptiles is target and or tap training. This isn't some like super high level of thought compared to what you can do with like cats and dogs, obviously, but you can absolutely enable reptiles to associate a certain symbol or a certain color or just a certain object with feeding time. You can also allow them to associate just being tapped with like a metal snake hook on the side of their body with, oh, I'm not getting fed, I'm about to be handled. There's going to be a human that's about to reach in and scoop me up. And both of these things are things that pretty much all the reptiles I've ever worked with have been able to pick up. Again, it's not super complex thought. I'm not saying that we should be thinking about reptiles in the same sphere as dolphins or chimpanzees. I'm just saying they do think. They do have like intelligent thought that we often just sort of dismiss as people. By now in this video, I hope I have helped to sort of get you away from thinking of reptiles as these cold, unthinking, uncaring monsters. And if you have, you should like this video. You should subscribe to this YouTube channel. I am working to improve the quality of these videos, and hopefully you've noticed a little bit of an improvement in the audio of this video in particular. It's a work in progress. It's going to get better, but your support on these videos, which I appreciate so very much, is the thing that helps to kind of motivate me to continue to make these little adjustments and changes over time. So thank you so much for liking this video. Thank you so much for subscribing to the channel. And if you're interested, you can consider joining as a member of this channel to support this content long term. So thank you so very much. Now let's get back to the last two reptile myths that just won't die. Number 4 is a myth I am almost certain you have heard before, and that is that snakes and lizards are slimy, that they are wet or icky or gross because of the texture of their body. And I have only ever heard this from people who have never touched a reptile. Because once you actually pet a reptile, you recognize that they are dry to the touch. In fact, not only are they not particularly slimy or any more slimy than most other animals, but they don't actually produce any oil, mucus, or sweat that almost every other group of animals alive produces. They are arguably the least slimy animals on the planet. In fact, if you pet a snake and you find that it feels slimy, it is you. You are the one that's slimy because it is just you rubbing your sweaty palm against a dry surface. The reason that many reptiles tend to look slimy or look shiny, which is more the reality, the more they look like they're kind of glistening and wet, is not because of anything that's on their skin, but instead because of their scales. Those scales are made of keratin and they reflect sunlight, making them look kind of shiny. In certain species, this results in an incredibly beautiful rainbow iridescence, but in other species just kind of looks like a white streak that is similar to what we see in an animal that is wet. Another mistake that people make is because we often lump reptiles and amphibians together, more people have held an amphibian like a frog or a salamander than have pet or held a snake or a lizard. So people remember that frogs and salamanders are actually slimy, are actually wet to the touch. And that's because their bodies actually produce a mucus to protect their skin, which is permeable because they need to breathe through their skin. Reptiles have no need for such mucus, so their bodies don't produce it. And you can say that that makes like amphibians kind of gross if you don't like the texture of their skin, but you probably just shouldn't be touching them because that mucus is a protective membrane to guard the very sensitive skin of amphibians. And if you are petting an amphibian, you could actually be like wearing away some of that mucus, which is part of why it's really never a good idea to pet most amphibians, especially if you have any oils or chemicals like sunscreen or bug spray on your skin, because their skin will actually absorb those chemicals and it could make them very sick, or in many cases it could straight up kill them. This isn't a video about amphibians, but I do think this point is important to touch on because I don't think people have like a real respect for the level of harm they could be causing an amphibian by improperly interacting with them. So just be very careful around wild amphibians and captive amphibians for that matter. But all this to say that reptiles just aren't slimy. They just can't be. the only times that you could really feel any sort of slime from a reptile, especially like squamates, like snakes and lizards, is if you like pulled them out of a swamp and there was still like some like wet swamp water on them, then they might feel a little bit wet, or if you yourself are a little bit slimy. So just keep that in mind next time you call snakes slimy. They're just not. They're shiny, not slimy. And the last myth, myth number 5 that I wanted to touch on in this video, has a little more to do with captive reptiles, and is a myth that has been permeating the captive reptile hobby for just far too long, and far too many people still believe this, and that is that reptiles will only grow to the size of their enclosure or the size of their environment. And this, on the surface, makes no sense. I don't know why people believe this. It's just kind of ridiculous. And I'm going to break down exactly why. The first thing that determines an animal's size is simply genetics. Like, how big is your species on average, and how big were your parents? Were they bigger than average? Were they smaller than average? The second thing that's going to determine an animal's size is diet. Are you eating more than the average of your species? Are you eating less than the average of your species? If you're eating more, you might get larger. If you're eating less, you might get smaller. And again, that's determined by your genetics. And those really are the most important things. And the final thing that might determine whether an animal grows to be larger or smaller is health. If an animal is particularly strong and healthy and is eating a good diet and had normal to above average size parents, that is going to be a bit of a larger individual, typically. And if an animal is sick, they have to divert more of the resources that would typically go to growth to just healing from that sickness. So they may stay a little bit smaller even as they age. And that leads me to the biggest issue I have with this particular myth, this idea that reptiles will only grow to the size of their enclosure, because that is only true if you are medically stunting an animal's growth. If you are keeping an animal that is so large in an enclosure that is so small that it physically cannot grow. It cannot like just fulfill its body's natural function, and you're not going to have just like a miniature version of the full-sized animal. Instead, you're going to have a smaller and like deformed version of that animal that is incredibly sick, that will have plenty of bone, muscle, and joint issues, and will likely just pass away really young, which may look to you like you had an animal that was smaller, but it in reality you just severely abused that animal, and that's why it stayed small. Not because reptiles grow only to the size of their enclosure. If we kind of expand this out to wild animals, I have also heard the argument that like crocodiles in particular have like no true maximum size and they will grow forever, and theoretically the only thing like stopping us from seeing like a 70-foot saltwater crocodile is because they don't like live long enough to get that big. And that also is just not really reality. Crocodiles do have like a technically like an unlimited a growth rate. Like they will continue to grow throughout their entire lives, but by the time they're full grown adults, that growth is so like minuscule that you wouldn't actually notice it. Like, don't get me wrong, there are crocodiles that are like genetic anomalies that end up being much larger than the average of their species, but that doesn't mean we're going to have like 50-60 foot crocodiles. That more means that we might have like a 33.5 foot saltwater crocodile, which, don't get me wrong, that is still an absolute giant, but it's not just going to be this totally different animal in a totally different size range than the rest of its species. It's just going to be a bigger than normal version of that same animal. And yes, it may continue to grow as it gets older, but not in a way that's like significantly different. That's going to like change the top max size of the species. I've heard similar arguments about things like giant reticulated pythons or green anacondas, and it's the same story there. Yes, you could have individuals that, as they get older, will continue to grow a teeny tiny amount, but they're not going to become these like crazy, crazy anomalies. Probably. I mean, like, it could happen, right? Like, we could get genetic anomalies. We see it in people all the time, but I think a really good example is like Shaquille O'Neal. He is a massive, massive human being, but he's still the size of like a human being, right? No one's gonna see Shaq and think he's like a different species or think that he's like outgrown like people. He's just a very large human that's still kind of like within the extreme ranges of human size. But those are 5 reptile myths that just won't die. Now, I don't really have a great strategy on how we kill these myths other than making a video like this, trying to educate as many people as possible about the realities of these animals. And I think the more people are educated about reptiles, well, the less we're going to hear horror stories about people's like fear of reptiles, kind of like I talked about in this video. But I also think that that would get more people interested in what reptiles actually are when they lose the image of the unthinking, uncaring, slimy monstrosity that so many people think of when they picture a reptile. But there are far more than just 5 myths that surround reptiles. So if you have a myth that you have heard frequently about reptiles, feel free to let me know in the comment section below, and we can either laugh about it or cry about it together. I hope that this video has helped you kind of show your friends that maybe don't know as much about reptiles a little bit of the truth behind the myths that surround these creatures that we love so very much. But I also hope that this video gave you a bit of a laugh. Some of these myths are like genuinely funny, and the more you think about it, the kind of funnier they get. Like, I like to think to myself, like, who was the first person that decided that like animals that need to bask in the sun have like cold blood? Like they're out in the sun because their blood is cold? Because if that's the case, then like how many of our grandparents that like to go south for the winter would be considered cold-blooded by this logic? I think it's quite silly. But with all that out of the way, my friends, thank you so very much for watching this video. Have a wonderful rest of your day, an awesome rest of your week, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.